So I'm very pleased to bring forward Jane Myles, who is the Program Director for DTRA, the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, who has over 25 years of experience working in this industry, all looking at how to make clinical trial experience better with a particular focus on the patient experience. And so we're very lucky to have her here, and please welcome to the stage Jane Myles.
Hello, I am so delighted to be here. It does feel like a homecoming. I haven't lived here in a while, but I did actually work at QLT here at the turn of the century. That sounds weird, but Vancouver holds a very dear place in my heart, as does the province of BC. So I feel very privileged to be here today and talk to you about something that really is my why, Dr. Siegel, and that is to enable patients to participate in trials, to get access to care, to change the diverse nature of trial participation, to speed up drug development and get scientific answers faster. But maybe underlying all of that, for me, is allowing patients the choice to participate, which I think is really why we're here. It's time for patients to know what's possible and to have options to get access to it. And now I don't know which mic is working. And I titled this presentation, "The Future is Now," because speaking with Allison, Jean, Rishi, and Mark, I heard that you're curious, but you're not sure what's possible. And so I'm not going to go through a long presentation on all the different solutions, but we will touch a little bit on the current state, what's happening, and where things are going. And I also want to acknowledge there are people in this room today who have helped us build some of the solutions I'll reference. So it might be something you could follow up on after we complete our panel. Okay, so DTRA is a cross-industry collaboration. It is something like the Transcelerate of decentralized clinical trials, with a couple of important differences. DTRA's members include sponsors, regulators from all over the world, solution providers, so that's technology and services and CROs, and patient groups. And the reason that I call that out is because the intention is to leave no stakeholder group behind and to really work on a cross-industry perspective on what will it take and how can this be better. So you can see the mission and the vision here. But I think what really fires me up about the work we're doing is that it is a combination of collaboration in a pre-competitive setting and community building. And so I've had the opportunity to meet people like Mark through the work that we do together. When DTRA was founded in 2020, the group worked with the Leadership Council and identified 4 key priorities, and I promise you I will not bore you with the eye chart slide, but I want to call out that the leadership across the member orgs defined these 4 areas. So first, definitions. What are we talking about? Are we using terms similarly? Then best practices. If you are going to use DCT methods, are there better ways to do it and things to avoid? Educational materials, because as we've heard again and again today, there's a ton of misinformation or simply information gaps around what trials are and aren't, and that extends beyond the public into research practitioners and clinicians. And finally, removing barriers, and we heard a little bit about that earlier today. So we chartered 12 initiatives. They have worked diligently, and now all 12 have produced deliverables which are actually summed up in this, which is another eye chart, but the reference is here on the bottom. So think of this as an end-to-end digital playbook on how you can think about and then set up your digital trials, starting with the design, Dr. Siegel, because I think that's critical, and going through the setup, the conduct, and the closure of the trial. So if you want to hear about the tube stop, talk to me, because it was a 3-year labor of love. About 300 people contributed to this. If you go into each of those stops, by the way, you double click into the resources from the initiative teams, from regulatory guidelines, and from tools that were created by other consortia such as Transcelerate, City, ECRP. So it is not a DTRA only set of resources. Now, here's my ask of you. We're trying to make this a living digital resource. When you find something missing, when you see something we need to add, there's a place to let us know on every page. And I get to read those comments, so send me what's missing, please. So that's enough about DTRA, but this is why I'm here. Because we do believe that the future is now and that these solutions are readily available. But it is all about designing with the end in mind. So let's start first with the premise of what the heck is a decentralized trial, and I'll myth bust a little bit. First, it's not a fully virtual trial. You may have a mixture of visits at a physical location and in your home or at a school or in a pharmacy. It's really the design of a trial in such a way that we reduce or possibly eliminate visits to a traditional research center. And I call that out because I hear so many different interpretations on this. And many people do believe that if it's not fully virtual, it's not decentralized. In contrast, other people think if we offer electronic consent in an office, it is decentralized. I'm like, well, actually, this is all about intent. This is the intent to decrease patient burden by shifting where the trial assessments are being done. So the good news about this is, from what I'm gleaning, all of the regulatory authorities are starting to sort of align around this definition, which is helpful because one of the areas of complexity is a little bit of difference in how different entities interpret these tools and methods. So now I'm going to talk about adoption challenges. And I am thinking about a prior conversation this morning where we talked about solutions and the glass half full, and that's really the message I want you to take away. There are challenges, but they are getting better. So this is a little bit of a busy slide, but there are 5 key themes, really, that seem to get in the way of different trial teams adopting these methods. The first is, gee, I missed something there. The protocol design itself. So we really need to figure out how to design with the end in mind. The global variability across the execution parameters, if you're doing a global trial and trying to manage all of the different regulations across all EU countries, is still a major burden. The technology interoperability and data flow is an ongoing challenge, and actually Nathan and his team, he's sitting in the audience, have been working on that amongst other people. Investigator and patient readiness is different. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how these things are changing. And then endpoint limitations. So we have lots of digital measures and an increasing number of them, and Dr. Ho is going to talk to us about that. But remarkably, not all of them are acceptable yet to regulatory authorities. And finally, organizational culture. So that first circle should actually be regulatory ambiguity. Let's talk about the arrows. The arrows are, is this trending better or is it getting worse? So regulatory ambiguity, that first circle, it's getting better. We are getting guidance. we can see that the different regulators are working to harmonize. I had the opportunity to listen to some of the regulators at the annual meeting, and they, of course, were talking about the FDA draft guidance, which came out in May, and they have received more than 800 comment packages to it. So that's not a one-page document. I know for DTRA, our document was 50 pages long, and they are going through all of those comments now to create a final guidance document by next year with some examples. Because what they are learning is they have set a forward-looking policy to say HCPs can be involved, we want to be able to use clinical care elements as part of trials, but they haven't necessarily set out what is an acceptable practice. So they set the direction, but not the operational framework. The global variability is getting better, but it's still sort of a straight arrow. It's not up or down. Technology interoperability, I think, is improving and quickly, and I hear that when I talk to people like Rick at Real Time, and also when I listen to regulators through the Office of the National Coordinator of IT. They're really working hard so that EHR systems can become the primary source of data, not a tool that you have to enter data from. And apologies, I'm using US references, but I hear that this is also going on in Canada. So let's talk about investigator and patient readiness. You see how those arrows don't have the same slope? Investigators are ready-ish, and I think Dr. Deagle just pointed out a couple of the hurdles there. We know that sites are overburdened and they're struggling with resources and technology and really trying to keep the ship afloat. So sometimes if the trial is designed without site input, it can feel like these DCT methods are an additional burden. So I wouldn't say they don't want to use these methods. I would say we still have work to do to make them a seamless part of the trial design and execution. But look at the patient arrow. You see how that's almost a straight up arrow? Patients are ready for this. Now, that doesn't mean every patient, it doesn't mean every disease state, but when we go back to that why of choice, patients do want to know, and they do want to have an option to participate. And some of them may need some training and support on using technology. They have the will to be involved, and that is really inspiring to me. We won't get into endpoint limitations a lot, but there is a lot of work going on with that, and I think Dr. Ho will probably talk a little bit about that. And then the last circle is organizational culture, and guess where? That's going down. And that's going down because there are economic factors, speed is always in the way of innovation. Again, I don't think it's I don't want to do this. I think that people are deeply constrained in terms of time and resources. So organizational change and change management is an integral part of the recipe of adopting DCTs. And when I say organizational, I mean all of them. Site networks, sponsors, CROs, and tech providers. Patients also need understand how this can help them. They want it, but they want to know that they do have agency over the data and how it will be used. So what do you take away from this slide? There are barriers, but mostly things are improving. Okay. This is the Gartner hype cycle. Have you heard of that? So with any new thing, you see this huge uptick in information and buzz and marketing. And then there's this, oh, that didn't go exactly the way I imagined. So it's called the trough of disillusionment. So you go through the peak into the trough. And then you start coming up through this slope of enlightenment like, oh yeah, this is real. It can get done. It just isn't the way that I thought it would be. And then you start with the long tail of adoption. Well, DCTs definitely went through this. You might even think about this now and watch for whether or not this curve happens with AI, which doesn't mean that I think AI isn't going to stay. I'm just saying this is a normal cycle with anything new and innovative. The thing I want to call out, and it became really clear at the annual meeting, is DCTs went through this Gartner hype cycle and got amplified in it because of the COVID pandemic. And that is because suddenly, in about March 2020, we all realized, oh my gosh, I've got trials. I got to keep them going. How am I going to do that? And so we adapted those trials to use the methods, which meant we didn't design with the end in mind. We really changed on the fly. And that added a ton of friction, cost. Everyone was working at speed. There was tons of regulatory friction that got removed to enable things. But guess what? It's back. So that whole adoption cycle got amplified in terms of expectation. But now that we're over here in 2023, I think we're beyond the trough of disillusionment and now into the slope of enlightenment, where people realize it's not going away. It isn't a Band-Aid. So you do have to be very methodical in the way that you design the use of the DCT methods in your study. But it will get there with practice, and we will start seeing best practices. I think there's another part of this that's going to help the curve, too. This is a different form of the adoption curve, but if you look here, you can see there was that pandemic uptick, and now you see that little hesitation in use, mostly because of economics, or people are thinking, maybe I can just go back to the old way of doing things. But as you move out to the right of this graph, you're going to see as regulatory submissions are approved using these methods, it's going to become a norm in the way we conduct trials. So by seeing that approvals are coming, we will de-risk the concerns that you won't be able to meet regulatory requirements. And that's already beginning, actually. Dr. Paul Klutz spoke at the annual meeting. He's the deputy reviewer in the Division of Oncology at FDA. And he made a point of stating on stage, not only do we support the use of these methods, we've approved medicines that used them in oncology. So when you hear people say that DCTs are great, but it'll never work on oncology, you can say, no, actually, that's not true. And in fact, the agency is a strong supporter of making sure all oncology patients get access to trials. Okay, so now we'll talk just a minute about adoption trends. You saw the hype cycle. Yes, we're coming up to speed now. But these are some facts that I pulled from a global data source. I'm going to caveat it because it's a public data source. They do a great job of trying to clean the data. But as you probably know, not every trial that uses DCT methods is listed as such in a place like clinicaltrials.gov. So there may be some gaps in the information. I think the overall trend is what you really need to look at. So you see this very slow adoption, then the spike, and we're about where the blue turns into gray. The interesting part to me is that the digital data collection, the use of wearables and remote monitoring, is the fastest growing segment in this graph, along with remote monitoring methods like not going to a research site to do your monitoring. I thought this was interesting too, because we used to see that decentralized methods were used primarily in phase 3 trials. And now we're seeing an increasing adoption in phase 2 trials. Now, my hypothesis about that is because people are trying to prove that the methods work in the phase 2 setting to then carry them through to the phase 3 registrational studies. So they're de-risking a little bit, setting up those regulatory conversations, and learning by doing. so they're ready when they go to the phase 3 setting. The other interesting element for me, which I'm not going to show you, is that the academic institution adoption of DCTs is outpacing the adoption by sponsors right now, which really surprised me for a minute. And then I thought about it. So I'm thinking about investigational sponsored trials and investigator-initiated trials, and they may be multi-center trials. But when the academic research center gets to choose the methods, the providers, structure all the contracts, there's less friction in the system and more willingness to innovate. So I don't think that we're going to see sponsors go back from DCTs. I'm just pointing out where there's less friction in the system right now. Okay, so all of this is interesting, kind of theoretical. We think it can do good things for research, but what do patients think about this? Remember, we are trying to do this so patients have choice to access trials. And what if they don't like it? So I get this question a lot. Well, it's fine that you recruited faster, but did they stay in? And did they enjoy the experience? And what about the trust equation with the physician? So before I show you this data, which is not my data, I want you to think a little bit about whether or not we have typically measured patient experience in trials. And I would say not in the trials that I ran. We measured clinical outcomes, but we didn't actually ask most patients, was this a good thing? Did you enjoy it? Did it save you time? Did it cost you time? And in a decentralized setting, if you're using a standard platform, you now have the opportunity to collect patient experience data outside of the clinical data set. So that might be an ask to you. Think about how you might do that. And if you're curious, there is a toolkit that Transcelerate has developed specifically for DCT patient satisfaction collection. Whew, out of breath. So, are you guys familiar with SysScript? Yes. I see one hand. So SysScript, two, three. Okay, good. SysScript has an acronym I can never pronounce, but they are a not-for-profit organization that is dedicated to educating patients about clinical trials. And for a little more than a decade now, they've been conducting this biannual survey on patient perceptions and insights. And one of the things I love about the survey is every time they conduct it, they do have some core themes they revisit so they can track trends over time. And then they add in the question of interest or the area of interest in this year's survey. So, the big takeaway on this slide, which is no surprise to you probably, but it's now in a data format, is that the number one thing that prevents patients from enrolling is traveling to the site. And it actually increased significantly between 2019 and 2021. I don't know if that was because of the pandemic, but it became an even bigger barrier, which to me is a signal we've got to fix that and find ways for patients to participate from other locations. And I'm really lucky because the panel is going to tell you how they can do that. But I think in a place like Canada, this is imperative, right? So a clear call to action from patients, we would do this, but you really have to make it a little easier for us. Now, this slide, which is a little bit of an eye chart again, really talks about how willing you would be to participate in these different research models. Some of them are completely virtual, some of them are hybrid, some of them are at your local physician's office. The takeaway from this is that patients are willing to go where they believe they will receive adequate care. It does not have to be a traditional research center. It does need to be a location that's equipped to conduct the trial in a compliant manner. But this should be another signal to us that patients are ready and we have to adapt our methods. I was really interested that local HCPs came very high on the list. I'm not showing you that, but when patients were asked for a little bit more information, they listed their own doctor, a community health center, and a pharmacist as 3 of the most preferred locations to conduct clinical trial assessments. So we can do this. They're going to tell you how. Okay, so this is the current state, but what's coming next? And this is my last slide. This is a teaser. So right now, we know we can use clinic or home visits, e-consent, we're going to talk about that, telehealth, we can do some remote monitoring, we can collect some specimens locally, and that's growing pretty much every month. But pretty soon, you're going to see these norms develop where you are conducting the assessments at locations beyond traditional trial sets, where you will be using AI-supported generative methods and tools for patient engagement and support, where participant optionality, that is, one visit is in the clinic and then next time I want to have it at a pharmacy, becomes the norm. This is operationally complex right now, but I think that patients actually are saying we want different options depending on where we are in our disease cycle and in the trial participation. I think this next one is really interesting, and this is where sites will actually define the technology they choose to use as they're conducting the trials instead of sponsors defining it. And this is one of the big friction points. But I've heard several regulators now say, this is where we need to go. We need to be willing to accept different data platforms and modalities for the same clinical data set. And finally, I won't get to the very last one, but endpoint modernization. Like, really, is the 6-minute walk test still a valid measure of patient activity? I think it's time for us to shift that. And I think we have tools that do that right now. But it's a question of helping the regulators feel like the data is comparable and congruent to what they understand today. So, that was your primer on DCTs and why the future is now. But if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them after we finish our panel. All right, come on up. All right, you're good. Perfect. Thank you. Okay.